What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. Patrick here. In this next video, and actually over the next couple of videos, what we'll discuss is the price elasticity of supply. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with an overview. We'll go through some examples. We'll also talk about some factors that affect it. Pretty much the same format that we went through when we talked about the price elasticity of demand. Now, before getting into this video, I want to make a heads up that when I'm talking about the price elasticity of supply, I'm assuming that you've gone over the videos dealing with the price elasticity of demand, because there's going to be tons of carryover, and so I'm going to go through this a little bit more quickly. A lot of the technical stuff I covered in more detail in the price elasticity of demand video. So if you haven't watched those, make sure you do before watching this one. Now, elasticity in general, when we first started to talk about it, we mentioned how we can look at it from different perspectives. So we can look at it from the consumer perspective, and that's when we talked about the price elasticity of demand. That's from the consumer perspective. Well, now we're going to talk about elasticity from the producer's perspective. And from the producer's perspective, we're going to be dealing with the price elasticity of supply. Now, the price elasticity of supply basically measures how much the quantity supply changes with a change in price. A less technical definition is basically how responsive producers or suppliers are to price changes. So if you remember when we talked about the price elasticity of demand, we mentioned how sensitive consumers are to price changes. You can use that word, but in a lot of textbooks you're going to see this word responsive or responsiveness come up when you're dealing with producers. So how responsive producers are to price changes. An even less technical definition is to say how easy it is for a producer to produce that good or service. So just in general, the more responsive a producer is, basically the easier it is to produce that certain good or service. So the more responsive, the easier it is to produce that good or service, the quicker it could be produced. That means that that good or service then has a more elastic price elasticity of supply versus the other case, the less responsive a producer is from price changes, the harder it is to produce. That's why they can't respond that quickly. Right? Maybe that good or service requires more resources. It's harder to produce. That means it's less elastic. Its price elasticity of supply is less elastic, or it's more inelastic. Less elastic, more inelastic. If you remember, those mean the same thing. Now, when we talked about the price elasticity of demand, we introduced a coefficient where we could technically measure it. And with the price elasticity of supply, there's also going to be a coefficient. So we'll call it E subscript S. And it's basically the same formula, but now it's going to be in terms of supply. So it's basically the percentage change in quantity supplied. Right, the percentage change in quantity supplied all over the percentage change in price of that good or service. This here is the price elasticity of supply coefficient. Now, a couple of things I want to mention with the price elasticity of supply, how it relates to the price elasticity of demand, or what's different about it. If you remember with the price elasticity of demand, we had to worry about negative values. We wanted to keep this coefficient positive, and so we had to introduce absolute values within the formulas when we were doing the calculations. Well, fortunately with supply, we don't have to do this. And the reason why when we dealt with percentage change in quantity demanded over percentage change in price, we know that the demand curve slopes downwards. And so if there was an increase in price, the quantity demanded would be decreasing, right? They have an inverse relationship, which would give a negative value for that coefficient. Or if the price was decreasing, then the quantity demanded was increasing. So there's always that inverse relationship, which would make that coefficient negative if we didn't use those absolute values. Well, with price elasticity of supply, again, it's good because price and quantity supplied, they actually are correlated, they move together. So if the price goes up, right, if the denominator here goes up, then the quantity supplied is going to go up as well. And so that's going to keep that coefficient positive. And if the price goes down, then the quantity supplied goes down. And so both of these would be negative, and then the negatives would cancel out, making it a positive. So this coefficient's always going to be positive, which is nice. We don't have to worry about any of those absolute values within the calculations. Another thing I want to mention is with the price elasticity of demand, we had something called the total revenue test. Well, with supply, we can't really do that because, as we know, if the price increases, the quantity supplied is going to increase. They have a direct relationship. And so no matter what, whether the good is elastic or inelastic, if there's a price increase, quantity supplied is going to increase. That means that total revenue is always going to increase. Basically, that total revenue test with demand, we were able to tell whether a product was inelastic or elastic. But here in this case, the elasticity is irrelevant when it comes to total revenue. Basically, if the price goes up, whether the product is elastic or inelastic, that quantity supplied is going to go up as well, so the total revenue is going to increase. And then if the price goes down, quantity supplied goes down, which means the total revenue is also going to decrease. So just be careful. Perhaps on a test, there may be a trick question where they bring up total revenue when they're talking about supply, and they may say, oh, the product is elastic or inelastic. It actually doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. It just, if that price increases, total revenue is always increasing. If the price decreases, total revenue is decreasing, right? So we don't have to worry about that when dealing with supply. With demand, though, it does matter whether that product is elastic or inelastic, right? So basically, this coefficient here, very similar to the demand coefficient, it could take on different values. So it could be 0, it could be between 0 and 1, and then between 1 and infinity. Now, if it's 0, what that means is that this here is perfect inelastic supply, right? Because that means that that percentage change in quantity supplied is going to be 0 over here. 0 divided by a certain number in the denominator is going to give us 0 for the whole coefficient, and that's going to be a perfect inelastic supply. Between 0 and 1, over here is just going to be inelastic supply. If it takes a value of 1, then it has unit elastic supply. If it's between 1 and infinity, it has elastic supply. And then if it's at infinity, it basically has perfect elastic supply. And so the way that all of these cases here look graphically, how that supply curve is going to look, now perfect inelastic, so we got price, quantity, supply, it's basically going to be a vertical line like that, because that quantity supplied is not changing, it's going to be 0. Now inelastic it's going to be very sloped. So it's going to be like maybe something like this. Let me label these. Like that right here. Versus unit elastic, it's going to have a slope of 1. So let's say it's something like this. An elastic supply product, it's going to be less sloped. So it's going to be almost horizontal, but not quite horizontal, maybe even. Just if we use this as the base here, I'll do something like that. Right? Versus perfect elastic, it's actually just going to be a horizontal line like that. Now, in reality, perfect elastic supply products, they don't really exist because no matter how easy it is to produce a certain good or service, it's always going to take at least some kind of resource, some kind of time, some more people, perhaps more technology. But something that has a very high elastic supply are things that basically can be mass automated. The production can be mass automated very easily. So something like, let's say, pencils, or maybe bread, for example, right? It's fairly easy to produce more of it if that price increases in the market. But again, even with something as easy to produce as pencils, it's still going to take some kind of effort to further produce more. So that perfect elastic kind of case doesn't really happen in reality, but the line can get pretty close to being horizontal for, again, products that are easy to produce. Remember, more elastic supply means it's easier to produce that product. Versus here on the other end, perfect inelastic supply products, they do exist. And so what this would be is, remember, the more inelastic, the less elastic the supply of a product, the harder it is to produce. And so perfect inelastic would basically mean that that product can't be further produced. So a good example of that is like land. Right? You can't produce or create further land. Another example is maybe like antiques, or maybe paintings from deceased artists, right? That artist is no longer alive, so they can't create those paintings anymore. And it's also why you see a lot of these things sometimes get so expensive. Because what happens, if we compare something like a perfect or a highly elastic product like pencils to a painting from a deceased artist, you can see what happens when you have an inelastic supply curve versus when you have a highly elastic supply curve, and how it relates with demand. So let's say that the demand is here, right? The demand is a downward slope. And let's say there's an increase in demand. So basically that curve is going to shift to the right. Now, if it shifts to the right, here in this case, look at how that price changes. Versus here, let's say we had that same demand curve. If it shifts, it might shift here, but notice that that price change from here to here is not as great as from here to here, right? And that's why these things can sometimes get so expensive, because when there's an increase in demand, it's going straight up. That price change is going straight up, versus here it's a little bit more slope, so that price change is not as drastic. It doesn't rise as quickly, right? So just a heads up that that's how those two different ends of the spectrum relate. And so what we're going to do in the next couple of videos is go over some more technical calculations dealing with the price elasticity of supply.